Since the dawn of time, humankind has been plagued with conflict. It started out right back in the beginning when a man named Cain was jealous with his brother, and he resolved that conflict by killing him. And as time has gone on and humanity has multiplied and technology improved, if anything, the conflict has gotten worse. Now, according to Will and Ariel Durant in their book, The Lessons of History, there have been approximately 268 years without war scattered through the last 3,421 years. So that means every 13 years of war, you get 1 year of peace. And sadly, the level of conflict seems to be accelerating, if anything. Now, that could be a perception brought to us by the media, but when we take into consideration that all it takes for conflict is 2 people, and now we have a world full of 7 billion, there's a real potential for conflict there, isn't it? And unfortunately, you don't have to imagine very hard to imagine the amount of conflict you can have with 7 billion people, because all you have to do is to look online, or to watch the news, or to just open your eyes and ears. We see conflict all around us. And I think one of the other more relevant reasons for why we have perhaps more conflict than ever before is because of the great technological advances we've had these days. The communication, the networking that we have has brought us great benefits, but they've also at the same time magnified the underlying truth of human interaction. And that really is that often we don't get along very well as human beings. And whereas as once upon a time our limited social group, our limited reach meant that we had less people we interacted with, and even those that we interacted with were more likely to be like us. But nowadays, it's very easy for us to stumble across someone who has a very different view from us. And quite often they're the ones looking for us as well. Now, in some ways, this communication, this interaction, it could have been a huge opportunity for us to open our minds and teach us new perspectives. After all, I'm sure that's what the people who created these technologies set out to do. And I hope that some of those ambitions have been realised. Hopefully we do have broader minds and more perspectives. But I think, sadly, in many cases, this improved interconnection highlights basically our fundamental inability to open our minds and to appreciate new perspectives. Now, although the challenges may have been magnified by improved communications and networking, the reality is we've always had to deal with conflict. Society has always had to deal with it, and we've found ways to deal with it in the past, some better, some worse. And tonight, before we launch into a study of how God teaches us to deal with conflict, let's have a look at how Western society is currently doing it and see how well that's working out for us. Now, the very first line of defence about resolving conflict has always been, it's been laws, or it's been standards of behaviour, isn't it? And it's, when it comes to these laws or morals, there's really two sort of layers there. The first, and often the best approach, is to minimise the conflict in the first place. If we can all agree on what's the right way to behave and what's acceptable behaviour, then we can avoid this conflict in the first place. We think about, you drive up to the roundabout and you give way to the right. And you do that and you're happy to do that because you know the person on your left will give way to you. And so you have these agreed standards and hopefully you will get through the roundabout without too much swearing. But if the conflict does happen, then there's the law as well. It's there to provide us direction on how we resolve it. If I'm the one who causes the crash, then I'm the one who has to pay for the repair bill to fix the guy's car. And I have to accept that whether I like it or not, because again, that's the law and that's the accepted standard of how we work. So the laws and the agreed social standards, they're the foundation that allow us to effectively deal with conflict. They're the bedrock. Now, the really tricky part, though, is deciding what should those laws be? What should those social acceptable standards be? And it's really hard, especially when you have different people or different groups and they have different opinions. Which one of those do you choose? Now, the approach that the West seems to be taking is to adopt a path that accommodates the maximum number of people. So rather than just pick one particular group and say we're going to back that particular group of values and rules, we're going to try and fit as many as we can into our rule base. It's almost like it's a lowest common denominator, if you will. And I think the rationale underpinning this idea is that, that all views and all standards are equally valuable and correct. So if you've got as many and they're all equally valuable, let's just try and pack as many of them in as we can. And so to support this ideology, we're encouraged to value and to seek out different groups and points of views. I mean, the 21st century, diversity is king. Diversity in race, diversity in gender, diversity in culture, diversity. All of these are praised and they're sought after. I mean, sometimes even they have no relevance whatsoever to the subject at hand. Now don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to discourage this idea. The will and the desire to have the coexistence of many different viewpoints is a wonderful thing. It's a wonderful ambition, and it's in many ways reaped some benefits for us. And while it's been great in some ways, there is some fundamental problems with the situation though. And to demonstrate that flaw, let me ask you a question, or a couple of questions perhaps. When was the last time that you heard of someone complaining about the lack of rednecks in politics? Or someone saying, hey, we need to set some quotas because we haven't got enough Nazis in upper management. You never hear anything like that, and I'm very grateful for that fact because, of course, that would be ridiculous. But the point that I'm using with this extreme is that there is this problem that even with much less extreme and much less radical groups out there, not all of them fit into this common ground. There are some groups that just don't fit. Now, religion is a classic example of a diversity group that you cannot comfortably bring into the fold because it's mutually exclusive. With a religion, you have a moral set about what is right and what is wrong, and some of those cannot coexist with the other things which are trying to be tolerated. And so you have this problem where some groups cannot be fitted into this super inclusive model. But don't fear, because there are already attempts being made to adapt the religions to eliminate this problem. If, for example, we took Christianity, if we got Christianity and we eliminated that, that troublesome problem about, sexual immorality, adultery, homosexuality, and we put all those to one side and we focused exclusively on the love of God, then we wouldn't have a problem. Everything would fine. It would still work within this nice, super sort of inclusive group. And that is exactly what we're seeing. Just to give you one quick stat, the PewResearch.org apparently found that in 2007, 44% of all Christians accepted homosexuality, while in 2014, it was 54%. 7 years, more than 10% different. Now, I'm not suggesting there's some sort of conspiracy out there to try and undermine Christianity or other religions. I'm just saying that there is a natural, intentional or unintentional pressure to redefine religion to fit into this supergroup. And the reason I'm highlighting this for tonight is because this is the way that highlights how society answers this conflict problem. The solution is don't manage conflict, eliminate it. So what you do is you don't deal with people with different views, you change them so that they all agree on whatever matters might generate the most meaningful sort of basis. And it's effectively creating this giant monoculture where you have this diversity, but it's only certain diversity. It's only certain acceptable diversity. Certain things must be the same. But this approach isn't something new. It's something that has been around for quite a while. Let me quote you a very well-known writing on this idea, which is perhaps relevant since it's a 50-year anniversary for this. It goes like this. Imagine there's no heaven. It's easy if you try. No hell below us, above us only sky. Imagine all the people living for today. Imagine there's no countries. It isn't hard to do. Nothing to kill or die for, and no religion too. Imagine all the people living life in peace. Now, I'm sure that most of you will know the rest of it, so I won't even try and sing it. But Mr. Lennon was making the same point 50 years ago. He was saying that for there to be peace, we have to eliminate the differences that create conflict. But ironically, if we look at the real world, we look at the world outside here, this obviously generates a new form of conflict because you're now intolerant of the people that are intolerant. But anyway, let's put that aside for a second. Let's just run with this approach and see where it leads. After all, if we did manage to influence people so they all agreed on the same fundamental values, then we should all get along, right? We've got nothing to really argue about anymore, do we? Well, that's true. But if we think about it, forcing people to accept the same common values, if that's the final solution, then the strategy we see today is no different from the same ideas that have been over and over again since the dawn of time. As the saying goes, the pathway to hell is paved with good intentions. Now, having said all this, I'm not saying that getting people to agree on the same core values is intrinsically evil. It's not, provided that, first of all, those core values are not evil themselves, and secondly, that people do it willingly. There'd be no problem at all with making everyone agree on the right rules as long as we knew what those right rules were. But unfortunately, since Western society is using that lowest common denominator, whatever we can fit in the most as the guideline to whatever those rules are, there is very little chance that we can meet that criteria of having a set of values that are intrinsically not evil. And as for people abiding by the rules, well, as I said before, you look out there and you can see it doesn't seem to be going too well at the moment, judging by the media and by the online. So when the laws and the standards don't eliminate the conflict, well, you are left with part two of the law. And how does the West deal with that? Well, that's easy. You go online and you sledge people. You accuse them of bigotry or hate speech. You take people to court and you sue them. You exclude them from your workplaces or your social groups. And even if you have to, you throw them into jail. Basically, you fight, you struggle, you stand up for your rights, because how dare people disagree with you and what you know to be right. And basically, you do whatever you can to win the conflict. And so it goes on, because the other person is doing exactly the same thing. And although you might win a battle, you never win the war until one of you dies, because it just goes round and round and round. And so we can see that kind of attitude is the reason why we're here tonight talking on this subject, because the reality is the world really struggles to manage conflict. So that's how the world deals with it now. That's how Western society is looking at it. Let's have a look at what God says. Let's see if there's a better answer to dealing with conflict. Now, the Bible, it takes a similar two-pronged strategy in some ways to dealing with conflict, where the first step is to try and minimize that conflict, and the second step is to deal with it. And the key technique that the Bible uses to reduce that conflict is actually a similar thing. It's to teach people the right way of doing things. In some ways, it's not that different to the world's approach, in agreeing on that common set of standards we'll all live by, and then we'll all be able to live peacefully together. But the huge difference is that where those standards are in the Bible, they're decided by God. Not by what's convenient, not by the common ground, the common consensus, not by the lowest common denominator. It's God. He knows what's right and wrong, and he tells us. But even when it comes to law, the way that it's meant to be applied is quite different as well. And to demonstrate this, let's think about perhaps the most well-known law of God, the law of Moses. Now, Moses, he wrote down a set of standards as told him by God that defined what was right and wrong. And if everyone abided by those laws, then there would have been very little conflict. And those laws, if you read them, they're exceptional, absolutely amazing, especially considering the time. But we don't have time for that because we're not really considering how great God's laws are in general. But let's focus instead on how those laws dealt with conflict when it arose. And perhaps the most famous of those laws around dealing with conflict was an eye for an eye. And this is where it comes from. Leviticus chapter 24. If anyone injures his neighbour as he has done, it shall be done to him. Fracture for fracture, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. Whatever injury he has given a person shall be given to him. Whoever kills an animal shall make it good, and whoever kills a person shall be put to death. And that quote, I think for many people, sums up how they see the law of Moses. It's a balancing of the scales, isn't it? That's how you resolve the conflict. You balance the scales and the case is closed, because you can't be upset anymore with the guy who scratched your car because we went and scratched his car too. You're even. Case closed. And of course, if we had time to go into more about the law of Moses, it's a lot more detailed than that, this really simple scenario, because life, as we know, is a lot more complicated than this. But nonetheless, it's a really good example of what the law sets out to do. It's there to provide justice. If you do something wrong, then you suffer as a result of that in equal proportion to the way you deserve. No more, no less. And in some ways, it's a really fantastic system because it's predicated 100% on justice. It's fair. It's as fair as you possibly can make it. You do this, that's the exact consequence, equal and opposite. But of course, there's a problem with this system. Or more accurately, there is a problem with us, because I think we find that this just system, it's really unpopular with both parties. Now, if we're the ones that were wronged, justice often isn't enough for us. We don't want the guilty person to suffer just as much as we did. We want them to suffer more. We want interest, right? They were the ones who started it. They need to be punished. They need more than what I suffered to teach them a lesson. And that's the sort of logic we have. But then if we're the guilty ones, we want to be shown mercy, don't we? But there isn't any mercy in the law. It doesn't matter that, oops, I didn't mean to poke out your eye. I'm going to have to lose my eye because of an accident. And that's just how you have to deal with it. As another famous saying goes, an eye for an eye makes the whole world blind. Does anyone know who said that? Oh, well, everyone thinks it's Gandhi, but apparently it wasn't. It was some British politician. But Gandhi sounds so much better, so let's just pretend it was Gandhi. The reality is that strict observance of the law to resolve conflict is not the best idea, not because there's something wrong with the law itself, but because there's a problem with us. Because it resolves the conflict, but the cost is generally too high and the animosity tends to persist. No one's really happy at the end of the day. It's like a compromise. No one wins. And it really has similar drawbacks to the approach we see today. It's like a framework for us to stand up for our rights. But fortunately, the law was never really meant to be observed in this way in the first place, because we have some people who've studied the law and have given us a really good extract. And the Lord Jesus Christ told us this: so whatever you wish that others would do to you, do also to them, for this is the law and the prophets. Now for this, what Jesus was actually referring was one little verse within Leviticus 19, verse 18 there. You shall not take vengeance or bear a grudge against the sons of your own people, but you should love your neighbour as yourself. I am the Lord. So all of those strict regulations and punishments and all that sort of legal side of things, it was there to encourage you to be kind to your neighbour. The main purpose of all those rules wasn't to exact justice. It was as a means to an end. It was there to encourage us to do the right thing in the first place. And that has real huge consequences for us. Now, Jesus expands on this very famous in his teaching from Matthew chapter 5, where he says this: you have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, but I say to you, do not resist the one who is evil. But if anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. And if anyone would sue you and take your tunic, let him have your cloak as well. And if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2 miles. Give to the one who begs from you, and do not refuse the one who would borrow from you. You have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbour and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies, and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be sons of your Father who is in heaven. For he makes his sun rise on the evil and on the good, and sends rain on the just and on the unjust. It's very important, that last verse there. Because this then is how Jesus teaches us to resolve conflict. When someone does something wrong to you, do something good for them. It's pure genius, because how difficult is it for you to be evil to someone who has been nice to you, to someone who is helping you? It just goes against human nature, doesn't it? And sure, there are wicked people out there who will take advantage of us for that. Let's not be naive. I mean, after all, look what ended up happening to Jesus. But the real motivation for us to do this is highlighted by that final verse there, where God does good things for the wicked and the righteous. Why does he do that? Because he hopes that one day the wicked will appreciate the good things and become righteous. But even if they don't, God has done everything that he can. Everything in his power he has done. It is their choice. And so far as much as it's possible in his hands, he's done whatever he can. And so likewise, even if a person who we're in conflict with continues to be nasty to us, continues to try and make that conflict continue, well, we've done everything we can, haven't we? Because we can't control what the other person does or how they react, but we can do everything we can to help the party, to help the resolution. Now, to give you a practical example of how this works, we can go to the Old Testament to show us that this isn't a New Testament idea. This is also heavily embedded in the Old Testament. Now, Abraham is probably one of the well-known people in the Old Testament, and he came many years before the law of Moses. And in Genesis 13, he had a conflict. He had a problem because he and his nephew Lot were so rich and had so much livestock that their herdsmen were fighting over the land to pass the animals. I know, it's a really terrible problem to have, isn't it? Got so much stuff. But nonetheless, this conflict could have escalated and it could have eventually damaged or destroyed their relationship. And Abraham makes the obvious suggestion that they're going to have to go their separate ways to be able to spread out to share the land. And that could have caused a lot of conflict because Abraham was a senior partner. He could have said, well, I'm going over here, you go over there, and that way he could choose the best land, presumably, for wherever he goes. But he doesn't do that. Instead, he says this: "Is not the whole land before you? Separate yourself from me. If you take the left hand, then I will go to the right. Or if you take the right hand, then I will go to the left." And what he effectively is doing here is he's putting Lot first. He's putting the other person first. And as a result, there's no strife at all. Imagine that. Putting someone else means they won't get mad at you. It seems so obvious, doesn't it? And yet in the same time, in our modern context, it seems such a foolish thing to do because, of course, we're going to get ripped off, aren't we? But ironically, that wasn't the case for Abraham. He ended up flourishing while poor old Lot, he found out that a lot of other people wanted the same land that he did, and it didn't turn out so well for him in the end. And the key thing as well was that Abraham was blessed by God, which is far, far more important than having the best and greenest pastures. But at the end of the day, let's be clear, I'm not saying that putting someone else first is a surefire way to maximise your income. But it is one way that God tells us to resolve conflict. And of course, if we are concerned about possible exploitation, there is still one other benefit on offer. Because if we treat others like God does, then God will continue to treat us the same way. It says this in Matthew chapter 7, "Judge not that you be not judged, for with the judgment you pronounce, you will be judged, and with the measure you use, it will be measured to you." And so that means that if we are kind and forgiving and someone does something wrong to us, then when we are the ones creating the conflict, then God hopefully will treat us kindly. Or maybe even the other person will treat us kindly as well, and they will resolve the conflict that way. And that is how really God manages conflict, by putting other people first. And just imagine, don't imagine a world without religion. Imagine a world where everyone put the other people first. Imagine how different that world would be from the world we see today. But when we think about others, it doesn't just apply to when you're actually in a conflict as well. It goes even further than that. Let me give you another example. As early Christianity spread throughout the world, many people joined who had a legacy of their own religions. That means they had their own baggage from worshipping other false gods. And Paul, one of the leaders of the early church, taught the people of Corinth that you had to be very careful how you acted in order not to offend these new converts to the truth. Now, Christianity, it doesn't distinguish about food. You can eat whatever you want. There are no laws about clean and unclean foods because Jesus made it quite clear that it's our thoughts and what's inside our minds that makes us unclean, not what we eat. So Christians can eat anything, and that's a very different concept from the Judaism that preceded it. But these new converts who came to Christianity, they were used to eating at things like feasts for false gods. They associated this idea of feasting on this food at these temples as a kind of worship of these false gods. And Paul was concerned that if he saw other Christians eating the food that was sacrificed to these idols, then he was thinking that these people might make some unkind associations. They might think that it's okay for you, as a Christian, to go and eat at other false gods and, in a way, worship those false gods. And so you had this very dangerous connection about eating this food. And so what he says to this, to sort of solve this problem, is saying, take care that this right of yours, this right to eat whatever food you want, does not somehow become a stumbling block to the weak. For if anyone sees you who have knowledge eating in an idol's temple, will he not be encouraged, if his conscience is weak, to eat food offered to idols? And so by your knowledge, this weak person is destroyed, the brother for whom Christ died. And so Paul was teaching us here that in order to avoid even creating conflict in the first place, again, you need to think about the other people. You need to think about your own actions and how you behave, even if that means giving up on your rights. Imagine that, giving up your rights, what you deserve, to protect someone else. And that's why Paul says, therefore, if food makes my brother stumble, I will never eat meat, lest I make my brother stumble. He's a vegetarian just in case it causes other people offence. It's the complete opposite sort of approach that we see so, rampant in the world today. Once again, we get this theme coming out over and over again. Don't think about your rights or what you're missing out on. Think about other people first. Now, a little bit of a change of tack, though. So it's great that we can help avoid conflict or manage the conflict when we do that. But there is also another point we need to consider as well. And this is another very famous saying, which goes like this: the only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing. Again, apparently Edmund Burke, but not Edmund Burke. So anyway, a very famous saying, and it's famous because it has that really succinct way of putting truth to it, doesn't it? We know if we look at the world and we look at corrupt people in power, we see how terrible influences that can have on us and the civilizations that they run. We need to find ways to contain the wickedness that lives inside all of us so that we can all live harmoniously together. But if we have this recognition that there is good and evil, then there is this fundamental concept that at least in some ways there is a right and a wrong. And if there is a right and a wrong, it follows that sometimes it's the right thing to do to stand up and fight. Conflict is essential as long as evil exists, because we need to keep the evil in check. Now Jesus, he puts this very clearly as well. He says this: do not think that I have come to bring peace to the earth. I have not come to bring peace, but a sword. For I have come to set a man against his father, and a daughter against his mother, and a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. And a person's enemies will be those of his own household. Whoever loves father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. And whoever loves son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. And whoever does not take his cross and follow me is not worthy of me. When it comes to choosing between good and evil, Jesus doesn't say, just let it slide. It's not a matter of, you can do what you want. You do the right thing, they can do what they want, We'll just let it slide. We'll all just get along. It's not how it works. It sounds a bit melodramatic, but in many ways, life is a war. It's a war between good and evil. And if you avoid conflict for the sake of peace and harmony, and then you let evil win, then you're contradicting the teaching of Jesus. That can be very confronting, can't it? Because we're used to this Jesus portrayed as a big softy who loves everyone, but that's not the real Jesus. That's the one-dimensional modern version of Jesus. Because, Jesus, he argued with the scribes and the Pharisees. He was a thorn in the side of the authorities. That's why they killed him. He used a whip to drive the wicked money changers out of the temple. Jesus, he was not afraid of conflict. But the amazing thing about Jesus was that he knew the best way to deal with conflict, whether it be physical violence, a verbal thrashing, or sometimes a gentle, kind word. And that's what we really need to try and understand. What is the best response to the situation? When is it the right time to stand up and fight? And when is it appropriate to turn the other cheek? Well, I'd be interested in your opinions afterwards, but the way I see it is this. When you see Jesus standing up and opposing people, he was fighting for God. He was defending the weak and the powerless. When Jesus healed on the Sabbath, in contravention of the law, he was helping people. When Jesus drove the money changers out of the temple, he was defending the honour of his Father. When he verbally attacked the Pharisees, he was destroying the teaching that held people back from the kingdom of God. But he never fought for his own benefit. He never defended himself. I think that's the lesson that we have to how to manage conflict. When we are wronged, we must do everything that we can to heal the rift by putting ourselves out. But when it is others who are being wronged, or when it is the truth that is under attack, we have a responsibility to intervene, to help the oppressed, to stand up for God. That is when we can fight. To give you another example, Paul, the same man who a minute ago in 1 Corinthians 8 was telling people to become vegetarians in case you offend people, he was the same man who stood up forcefully in the early church on many occasions to fight against circumcision, because he knew that that was bringing in false doctrines. It was a reversion back to the old law of Moses. And so he stood up and fought for it furiously when required. The same man who we saw minutes ago was a gentle man. So that leads us to the next question, though, in terms of what's the best way from a practical point of view for us to stand up? Because there is a right way to stand up and there's a wrong way as well. Now, I don't know about you, but when someone wrongs me, my normal natural reaction is to become passive-aggressive. Now, you might not know this, but I'm pretty passive with my passive-aggressive. So the offender, they might not even know that I've got a grudge against them for a very, very long time. And that's right. Some of you are sitting in the audience right now. You know me. You think we're okay. We're mates. But maybe we're not. Maybe I'm just waiting. And you'll never know. Just kidding. Probably. Because stage 2 of the passive-aggressive approach is to go and tell everyone else, don't you? You don't go talk to the person that's offended you. You go and talk to everyone else about what they've done to you. Can you believe that such and such did this to me? You know, aren't they a terrible person? And for me, that goes on for a while. And then I'm too lazy. I just forget about it. And then eventually the grudge goes away because I just, move on. It's not the greatest approach, is it? It's not really great at dealing with conflict. And sadly, I don't think I'm really unique in this technique. Hopefully, I'm not quite as bad as I described. And there are plenty of other tactics out there as well. I mean, you can go out there and, as I said before, go on the internet and say what you want on there. There's plenty of other tactics of how you can deal with conflict. But these kind of behaviours that come to us naturally, they don't tend to solve the problem, do they? They just inflame it. The far better approach is given to us by Jesus. Now, this is what he says in Matthew chapter 18. He goes, "If your brother sins against you, go and tell him your fault between you and him alone. If he listens to you, you have gained your brother. But if he does not listen, take 1 or 2 others along with you, that every charge may be established by the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses. If he refuses to listen to them, tell it to the church. And if he refuses to listen even to the church, let him be to you as a Gentile and a tax collector." Brilliant advice. Simple, structured. Lesson number 1, have the courage to go and talk to the person. Do it in a non-confronting way as well. Find a way that you can do it in private. The key thing is to, once again, be considerate. Take the pressure off the person so they don't have to swallow their pride. And the other great thing about this as well is it also gives them a chance to explain their side of the situation. You never know, you might find there's a lot more going on. You might find that maybe even you have some fault in the situation. It's a lot easier for us to find that sort of information out in a private place as well, isn't it? But then you may find that they continue to do the wrong thing. And in that case, again, bring along a couple of reliable people to see, basically to arbitrate and to witness, to tell you what's going on. And again, you don't need to make it a public spectacle. You're still trying your best to resolve instead of to punish the person. But then at last, if you've gone through all the steps and you still can't resolve the situation, only then do you make it public. And again, you need to think about why you're doing this. What is your rationale? Are you doing this because it's going to help people, or are you trying to make a public spectacle of them? Again, that guides our behaviour all the way through. Now, another important lesson that Jesus teaches us is that we have to try and resolve things quickly. He said in Matthew chapter 5, "So if you're offering your gift at the altar and there remember that your brother has something against you, Leave your gift there before the altar and go. First be reconciled to your brother and then come and offer your gift. Come to terms quickly with your accuser while you're going with him to court, lest your accuser hand you over to the judge and the judge to the guard and you be put in prison. So again, we have this idea that this conflict that you have with others, it can intrude on your own relationship, your relationship with God and your relationship with others. It's almost like it's an illness eating you up inside. So rather than just nurse that illness, go and do something about it. Resolve it as quickly as possible so we can go back to being the way we were. Now that's a couple of practical side of things as well, but it's always kind of assuming that the other person is the guilty party. What should we do? What Bible advice do we have, or godly advice do we have if we're the ones who've done the wrong thing? Well, if we go back to the book of the Old Testament again, there's another man in there in the book of Genesis named Jacob. And Jacob's name means supplanter. In other words, he takes the place of someone else. And Jacob, well, he was a crook. There's not really any better way to put it. He stole his brother Esau's birthright through a straight-out deception. And stealing the birthright in those days basically meant that he inherited twice as much as his brother. So it was a big deal to steal your brother's birthright. And so naturally that made his brother, the one he stole it from, Esau, very, very angry, to the point that he was planning to kill Jacob. And so Jacob, in our story, he legged it. He left his home and he went off to a far-off land. So far, so bad. And eventually Jacob learns about, through his experiences in that far-off land, basically what he'd done. He came to realize the terrible thing that he had done. And he matured as a person. And in the end, he didn't decide, he was sort of forced to leave that land as well and to return home. But when he did return home, he was a much wealthier and a much wiser man by that point in time. But he was still in terror of his brother. He was still petrified of what Esau would do to him. And what he did next is an important lesson for us, because when he returned, what he did is he sent gifts, lots and lots of gifts to his brother to apologize for what he'd done. And then when he met his brother, he bowed down to him 7 times. He basically humbled himself in front of his brother. And it's also very insightful to read what happened next, because it says that his brother ran to him and embraced him and they wept. And it seems from the account that his brother had already pretty much forgiven him. He didn't need to even provide those gifts. His brother had forgiven him before, and they basically were reconciled. But the lesson that Jacob teaches us is that if we have wronged someone, then we have a responsibility to do something. Don't go run off, hide in a foreign land. Come back and address the problem. Do what you can. Find a way to make it back to the person. Speak to them. And most importantly as well, you can find sometimes that person may not be as, begrudged to you as you might think. Maybe they've already forgiven you as well. All you really need to do is give it a chance. So the point is, if we have done the wrong thing, don't just ignore it. Work at it. Do something to try and mend the bridges. And very briefly, while we're touching on this subject of forgiveness, it's a subject worthy of its own night, but Jesus very briefly taught us. Peter came up to him and asked, "Lord, how often will my brother sin against me and I forgive him? As many as 7 times? And Jesus said to him, I do not say to you 7 times, but 77 times. Very well-known passage, but of course telling us that when it comes to us at least, we should be forgiving an infinite number of times, again, because we would want those infinite forgiveness from God. Now, I'll just check how we're going for time. Very briefly then, we're running close to the end, but there's a few more key lessons that I want to investigate from the New Testament. If we think about what Jesus did when he sent out his disciples to the world, he knew they'd face opposition. He knew that because he himself faced opposition. He says this in John chapter 15, verse 18 to 19. If the world hates you, know that it has hated me before it hated you. If you were of the world would love you as its own. But because you are not of the world, but I chose you out of the world, therefore the world hates you. So when Jesus sent his disciples out, he knew that they would face conflict. And he actually gave them a strategy on how to deal with this as well. What he said to them was, in Matthew chapter 10, as you enter the house, greet it. If the house is worthy, let your peace come upon it. But if it is not worthy, let your peace return to you. And if anyone will not receive you or listen to your words, shake off the dust from your feet when you leave that house or town. And so that message is clear, and it's something that we find in the book of Acts, where the early church was spreading around, that they took this advice. If you go to people and you can help them, speak to them, spend time with them, do what you can with them. But if they won't accept what you say or what you think, don't try and force it down their throats. You're not there to burn them at the stake or to burn them on Twitter because they disagree with you. Just move on. There are plenty of other people out there who need to hear the message. They've had their chance. Move on and find someone else who will listen to it. And Paul, a man that I've mentioned several times tonight, he took this advice to heart. He would travel to a new place. He'd teach the people there as long as he could in safety. And then what inevitably happened is resistance would build up and he would just duck out as soon as it became too severe. And then, of course, if he could, he'd get the chance to come back at a later time. So really, give people a chance. But if they reject it, that's okay. It's their choice. After all, that's what we're all here to do, isn't it? To make our own choices. So, in conclusion, you probably can't read, that's probably a bit small. Let's just recap what we've covered off tonight. Now, Western civilization, as I said at the start, is experiencing more and more conflict because it encourages people to stand up and fight for themselves rather than put others first. And because it's actually trying to create a society that ironically is less tolerant than at least they want it to be, and perhaps even less tolerant than it has been in the past. The second thing we covered tonight was the secret source of managing conflict. It's really just to put others first, whether that be before the conflict has occurred or even after the conflict has occurred. If you're putting other people first, you are giving it the best possible chance that you can as an individual to make the conflict be resolved. However, having said that, sometimes conflict is a necessary part of life. It's not something we should always shy away from. We need to think about whether fighting is the right thing to do, whether we're trying to help others, we're trying to help God, or whether we're fighting because we feel ourselves wronged or that we're standing up for ourselves. That's one of the most important factors about whether we should fight or not. And finally, even when we do get into conflict, there is still a right way to do it. And once again, it's carrying that theme through, isn't it, of thinking about the other person. How can you do the best that you can to help the other person, even though this conflict is a necessary evil? And the reality is, though, that while we have wickedness in this world, we will always have conflict. And the good news is that God does have a plan to solve it once and for all. And that plan is to choose people who are willingly trying to join God's family and to bring them into God's kingdom, where we'll all be united with like-minded people. We'll be fully taught by God. And so we'll finally reach that state where everyone is actually thinking the same, and therefore there isn't any conflict because we're all on the same page. We all agree with the same standards. And best of all, they're God's standards, which means they're spot on. And in that case, there'll never be any need for conflict ever again. And that's the opportunity that God has offered to all of mankind.